want to thank everybody for joining us and welcome them as we host, as the Economic Club hosts Paul Mason discussing what's next for the global economy. So again, thank you for supporting the Economic Club and our mission. Very briefly about the Economic Club, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan, non-political organization designed to provide an independent and open forum for discussion on national and global economics and public policy. We were formed in 2013, and we were also the affiliate chapter of NABE, the National Association for Business Economics for Las Vegas. At different points throughout the year, we'll bring in speakers of regional, national, and now international renowned to discuss topics and to share their perspectives with Las Vegas and to hear our perspectives as well. At this point, I'd like to recognize our board and our officers. I appreciate all of them for attending and, pardon me, their hard work and their time. It's very generous, very helpful, and we couldn't do it without them. Specifically, I want to recognize today the very good and hard work of Oliver Lovett and Jason Sadow, who really bent over backwards to set this event up. So thank you to them. I also want to thank our sponsors. You saw the rolling sponsors presentation at the beginning, both in terms of financial support and in helping to spread the word about the work we're doing in the Las Vegas and Southern Nevada community. So during the call today, we're going to hear about Paul Mason, and then Paul's going to present, followed by a moderated Q&A. I am going to introduce Paul Mason. Paul Mason is an economist of significant renown, and I could go through a very long list of TV appearances and Channel 4, and I mean, it would just go on and on. But at some point, we have to recognize that we have a world-class economist and a world-class journalist here for our speaking pleasure, and he has a wonderful presentation ready for us. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul, and thank you for attending.
Thank you, Ken, and welcome to everybody. It's nice to be virtually in Las Vegas. The only time I've ever been there in person was just before the 2008 crisis, covering the CES show, and I hope to be back one day. But that was almost the last confident year, I think, that many of us spent in business and covering business. So, Jason, can you start my presentation, please, if possible? So I'm going to talk today from the point of view of a journalist who is covering mainly the developed world, global macroeconomics. Those of you who know my work will know that it is associated with the left of politics, but I'm going to try and outline what I think could be an emerging consensus across politics about the way we're going to deal with the coronavirus. So to start, next slide, Jason, please. Every crisis brings to the force some really scary acts of imagination, and I wanted to start with this quote from Macquarie Wealth Management in the middle of March, when we realized how bad COVID was going to be. Macquarie has about $350 on assets under management. It's the biggest Australian investment manager, and these words shocked me. They basically said that conventional capitalism is dying. The world is headed for, quote, something that will be closer to a version of communism. Now, in the analysis, what they basically said is, look, we're moving towards a situation where fiscal and monetary levers converge. So central banks and treasuries act in lockstep. It looks a lot like what the modern monetary theorists have been arguing, the MMT people, that we're moving towards universal income guarantees. And as they said, the effective nationalization of capital. And for them, that, as they said, looks something like communism. Well, as someone who has studied the economics of communism, I can tell you that it isn't communism, but I'm pretty certain that the impact of this disease is going to push several countries and indeed the global system closer to a new model of capitalism. So obviously, because a lot of the epidemiology is guesswork, the economic forecasts have to be guesswork. The US death toll a few days ago was just over 80,000. University of Massachusetts survey of experts every week. They poll 20 or 30 experts every week. And the range of forecasts of the depressing and sad number of Americans who are going to die from this disease by the end of this year ranges in the UMass survey from 118K to 1.2 million. And the link for that is at the bottom of the slide. Now, because of that, we just can't predict. Until this week, the UK, our Office for Budget Responsibility, our Treasury, our Bank of England was predicting as a base case the so-called V-shaped recovery, where we get some scarring, some credit damage, but in the end, the bounce back late 2020 mirrors the slump we're going through now. There was a leaked document in the British newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, yesterday, which leaked an internal British Treasury forecast that was much bleaker. The internal British Treasury forecast really now takes as its central scenario a U-shaped recession lasting most of this year with permanent scarring and some quite serious knock-on effects into the financial system. I haven't seen that document. I've only seen the leak, the report of it. But the interesting thing was that if that's right, then I think most developed world treasuries will be privately preparing for something worse than they are already publicly predicting. And just to give you an example of the British, the impact of that, as you know, the Brits are obsessed with public finances in a way that the American federal government is not. The American public is quite obsessed, but you're borrowing quite a lot at the moment. The United Kingdom has 1.75 trillion pounds worth of debt right now. And in the worst case scenario that was modeled by our Treasury of an L-shaped depression lasting half a decade, we borrow in the next 5 years another 1.2 trillion. So it's a huge downside risk that I think most treasuries are modeling. The short-term problem for me is not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is that the economic model that this thing is hitting is already broken. Exhibit 1 here is, I'm sure, a reality that will be familiar to most of you. It is blue line, US Treasury yields over the last 50 or 60 years. And then federal deficits as a percentage of GDP. And the federal deficit, the dotted line, is the estimate that Deutsche Bank did of where your deficit's going to be at the end of 2020 if all the commitments of the Treasury are made good on. So you can see that we have a long-term problem here. We're at the end of what my favorite economist, Nikolai Kondratiev, called a long cycle. And Kondratiev, there's a Russian economist working in the first quarter of the 20th century, died in the Gulag, of course. He would have recognized this graph because he thought, at the end of a regime, at the absolute sort of last gasp of an economic model, you really go into negative interest rates and states start to get themselves into massive amounts of debt. And that is what was already happening across the global north before this hit us. One of my favorite quotes in economics is this from John Maynard Keynes from The General Theory in 1937. He was talking about modern capitalist economies are monetary economies because of uncertainty. And Keynes says the importance of money is essentially flows from its being a link between the present and the future. What I think he means is that what we do with money today indicates what we think is going to happen in the medium term in the future. Now, in this next slide, which we could have, please, Jason, well, I'm going to show you what we've been doing with money for the last 10 years, since the 2008 crisis. So the short version of what's going on here is that since 2008, we didn't deleverage. In particular, non-financial corporations and governments leveraged up more, so that the combined corporate, household, and government debt is now 322% of GDP, and it will shoot to 342 if, as the IMF predicts, there's a global slump this year, the minus 3% GDP global slump. That's the source for that is the International Institute for Finance. Flip to the next slide. So that's debt. That's, we're already carrying a huge amount of debt. And then on the eve of the crisis, look, this is the other problem. The whole thing's maintained by central bank support. Central bank balance sheets didn't fall after, the unwinding. Look at it. The Fed's unwinding, barely registers on there. You've now got the Bank of Japan, Swiss National Bank, really up there. The conclusion I draw from this is that we have an economic model that is no longer working for a lot of people, and you can't, you can keep the economic model on life support. The central banks are clear; they were always planning to do what they're doing now. It was always in their armory to print money, to expand their balance sheets, to boost liquidity, to do swap lines. We've even got a thing in the United Kingdom called the Ways and Means account, which is an undisclosed overdraft from the central bank to the Treasury. But you can't keep an ideology on life support. A lot of people are now thinking this COVID virus, is basically has to be seen as a kind of hard stop for a system that didn't work. As you know, across the developed world, there is a growing crisis of belief in democracy, human rights, the rule of law. These pictures on this slide are pictures I personally took on the same day, 100 meters from the British Parliament. So you've got at the top the far left protesters, and you've got at the bottom the British version of the alt-right. And they didn't like me taking their photo. So we already had a more than economic, albeit a kind of existential crisis of the model. So if we flip to the next slide, here's how I think this is going to play out. If even we get now that what are becoming the central scenarios of a U-shaped recession with significant financial after effects. And as everybody knows who's in business, at the moment, you see, 2008 was like a lightning bolt. The worst thing in 2008 happened on the 15th of September and in the week afterwards. We kind of knew what the worst was. I liken this to a tsunami because the worst thing is that businesses who are pretending and extending now 30 to 60 days overdue on repayments on loans will not be able to do that with any regulatory compliance after 90 or 120 days. So the tsunami of bad debt is building rather than suddenly appearing on a single morning as it did in September 2008. I think it's a no-brainer that we're going to see higher debts and deficits throughout the G7 countries. We're already seeing the overt monetization of debts by central banks in Japan. I think it's arguable that this is what the Fed is doing. The British Central Bank, I get to speak to them, on an off-the-record basis. They are well prepared to do more than they've already done, and we are seeing helicopter money. We are seeing your bailout checks in the United States. We have a furlough scheme that covers 80% of salary for 7 million workers, which is more than a quarter of the employed workforce here. It's costing, as you know, we have a very generous state-funded healthcare system. It's costing per month more than the entire healthcare system. And I think as a result of that, we've already got treasuries looking for ways to build back the tax base. And I think that it's another no-brainer that before they start raising goods and services taxes and corporation taxes on hairdressers and small garages. They are going to be talking to the big global technology companies about onshoring some of their profits. So if we flip to the next slide, I think the bigger uncertainties lie, as I'm sure many of you are aware, around the geopolitics, because what we're seeing here is the erosion of multilateral institutions. Today, the Burundi government, small country in Africa, kicked the World Health Organization out because it was basically complaining that they weren't fighting the coronavirus correctly. They're in the middle of an election. We've got already really quite fractious and dysfunctional multilateral institutions, as you know. Until January, I lived inside one, the European Union, but also the UN, the IMF. As you know, the IMF was blocked from taking action to support China and Iran by your country. So with the background of that, it again, I think is a no-brainer that the US-China trade war will continue. But behind that, what I think the most interesting thing to me is we're seeing the beginnings of a question mark being placed over the fundamental deal that underpinned globalization. And we're even seeing, as you know, if you read in the Washington Post, the now denied report that sections of the federal administration are even contemplating a unilateral debt default against China as a proxy for reparations. So, for those of you who study the early 1930s, the Great Depression, you will know that it wasn't simply the economic downturn. It was the fact that the economic downturn spiraled into a series of tit-for-tat retaliatory geopolitical measures, including the non-payment of war debts by Germany to France. For me, what the biggest question mark then is, do the socio-political regimes that emerged over the last 40 years survive? Now, what I mean by this is we've got, as you can see from the photographs, we've got the two archetypal economic regimes in the world are China producing stuff and its workers saving money, and America buying stuff and its workers borrowing money. The Berlin Hochschule economist Eckhard Hein is one of my favorite writers on this, calls these two extremes export-led mercantilism, so that's China, but also Germany. Germany plays the same game. Its export market is Europe. And then debt-driven consumption, which is the USA, UK, Spain, Greece, for example. And Hein wrote in 2016, look, the problem with these regimes is they actually both feed the current stagnation, because each regime makes it possible for entrepreneurs to gain what he calls profits without investment, because you can always do credit finance consumption here in the developed world, in London where I'm sitting, or where you are in Las Vegas. And if you're in Beijing, then basically the People's Bank of China, if your share price goes south, People's Bank of China will always step in with orders to people, journalists not to report that, and then orders to people in the markets to buy your shares. So Hein basically argued as early as 2016 that these two extremes feeding off each other are non-sustainable, and they're feeding what that initial graph I showed, the long-term decline in interest rates, is actually, they're feeding that. The answer, and I think the interesting thing is that, of course, as an economist associated with the left, with the Labour Party in Britain, with some of the centre-left governments in Germany and German regions, this would be a thing. The thing you're seeing there, those bullet points, would be a thing that I am very familiar with and have indeed advocated here in the United Kingdom and in parts of Europe. But the interesting thing that's happened in the last 4 weeks is we're now seeing, at least in the United Kingdom and also in Europe, significant figures on the political right come around to a debate that says this is the way this might have to go. And what are the elements of a different model? They are that those of us who are, whether we're reliant on debt-fueled consumption or export-led growth, we step away from the extremes towards a more domestically demand-driven form of growth. So that means that means one of the other bullet points, you need a higher wage share. You need real wages need to grow. The state has to become entrepreneurial. One of my colleagues, Mariana Mazzucato, wrote a book a few years ago called The Entrepreneurial State, where she describes the federal state's role in the United States in the development of big tech. But I think if we then adopted that, and also in defense, of course, if we adopted that state-directed, state subsidy, state involvement approach across a wider field of sectors, then I think that we would have a greater chance of coming out of this with something dynamic. And of course, all of it, there's an open goal here in terms of a real need, if we're going to meet the climate, the Paris climate targets, for green technology investment. So what I'm basically saying is that I think a debate will emerge and has emerged, which didn't emerge in 2008, about, look, this model has kind of reached its end point, and the smart governments are going to be the ones, as in the 1930s, with the British government in 1931 and FDR in 33, saying, look, we need a whole new approach to the way we govern economic growth. So to cut to the chase of the last couple of slides, I wanted to end by giving you a really long view. So this is a very interesting piece of research done by the Bank of England economist Paul Schmelzing this year in January. And it's an attempt to talk into the ongoing debate about secular stagnation. You will know that Lawrence Summers initiated this debate, saying, look, we may be going into a secular stagnation period. Summers believes it's driven by contingent factors, by the fact that we've got an essentially elderly saving population in the Western world that doesn't want to expose its savings to risk, and therefore crowds into the risk-free investment of government debt and drives down the cost of borrowing, full stop. Now, Schmelzing doesn't agree with that. He says, actually, for the whole of almost modernity and beyond, interest rates have been falling, and his time series goes back to the 14th century. If you're stuck at home with nothing else to do, it's a really brilliant, freely accessible piece of research that I think will make you think. But Schmelzing also argues that actually, because of this, throughout history, at times of, especially at times of crisis, quite a large number of major countries have effective negative real interest rates. So if we flip to the next slide, this is the really interesting thing I want to leave you with. So the graph is Schmelzing's graph. Whether you choose the blue or the red line, it's a 3 or 5 year moving average of how much of world GDP is experiencing negative real interest rates. And if you go to the right-hand side of the graph, you'll see that in World War I and in World War II, the Western world had a sudden spike of almost everybody was experiencing towards the end negative real interest rates because of the boom time of the wartime and the fact that as with war bonds and other stuff like that, the savers' money is trapped and has to be lent to the government. Now, this is the thing. Deutsche Bank, this graph's from a Deutsche Bank research note a couple of weeks ago. Look at the red circle. Right now, at the top right of that graph, right now, they argue probably 95% of the world's GDP is stuck at a point of negative interest rates. So the secular stagnation debate has to really be had. What's causing it? How do we get out of it? Because the COVID-19 has absolutely exploded and exacerbated all the problems of negative real interest rates that we were all discussing at a kind of academic level, in a kind of relaxed level. I would say that's a really urgent question to discuss. So I hope that's been food for thought, and that we've got some time left for questions. Throw them at me. I'm used to a very combative and feisty form of discussion here in the UK anyway. But thank you for listening.
All right. Thank you, Paul. That was terrific. We do have time for questions, and in fact, I've been receiving a number of questions, and wow, there's lots of good questions. Please keep them coming in. I'm going to type a message to everyone so that they understand where to submit your questions. Please send questions here. Okay. All right, so there's a lot of good questions coming in, and I'm going to get to all of them. Wow, this is terrific. So let me give you the few that I've already been able to moderate that have come in during the questions. Paul, you're not going anywhere for quite some time. I hope you have some time free. All right, the first question is talking about negative interest rates. What is the viability of negative interest rate policies in the long run, not just now because because of we're in a crisis, but in the long run as a typical case?
Well, look, I don't think that negative interest rates are a policy, in the sense that I think they are the result of a glut of capital in the world. We had that debate in economics: is it oversaving by Asia or underspending by America and Britain? That was the debate in the 2000 decade. I mean, whichever way you play it, there is too much capital chasing risk-free investment. As I said, Summers believes it's because we've got an elderly population that doesn't want to take risk. Others, like Hein, who I quoted, he believes that in fact it's the result of monopoly power. So that monopoly pricing power allows for a mispricing of capital and misallocation of capital there. Again, whatever's causing it, it's there. So the central banks, I think, have learned that and this was always the case, it's much easier to use money as an anti-crisis measure, money creation, than it is to do fiscal stimulus, fiscal counter-cyclical measures. This was the argument that John Maynard Keynes actually had with the Hoover administration before FDR. He said to them, the pathetic fiscal measures you're doing have to be combined with a strong monetary stimulus. Now, central banks were very, very slow to learn that in 2008. If you remember, they all said, we're printing the money, and then it'll all come, we'll sell these bonds back to the marketplace in a few years' time when everything's back to normal. QE is now the new, quantitative easing is now the new normal. And that, in the last couple of years, tipped interest rates negative in Germany, negative in large parts of the developed world, Japan, not so much in the United States yet, but you've got it. So I think we are stuck with those policies until we find a form of dynamism. Mark Carney, who was the governor of the Bank of England until this year, made a speech in 2016 where he said, look, we, the central bank, all we can do with these policies, we can build a bridge, okay? But you guys have, i.e. the politicians and the private sector, have to decide what the destination of the bridge is. We can't build a destination with monetary policy, i.e. what is the new model? And Carney said famously, if you don't build the destination, the bridge becomes a pier and we fall off it. So I think that we are now at the end of the pier. We're falling off the boardwalk because it is for politicians. And I think if the United States presidential election were a little less personally feisty and more policy orientated, this is what it would be about. What is the way forward? How do we get out of perpetual self-reinforcing negative interest rates and stagnation?
Excellent. Thank you very, very much. By the way, thank you for keeping these questions coming. You guys are making my job very lively, so I appreciate that. A few questions about the U.S. and China trade war, please. There's no debate, and I'm right now I'm trying to bring a number of questions together into something that's cohesive and logical. So give me just a moment. The U.S.-China trade war is clearly detrimental to global economics, but does the U.S. have a moral responsibility to, and I'm going to edit a little bit, to not reward the actions and the misinformation that's coming out of China? In my career, I think I spent
quite a long time in China, cumulatively. Every time I was allowed to report from China, it was not worth going for a week. So I usually spent a month there, and I think it's 6 or 7, cumulative months over the years. The be in no doubt that this is the mismatch. China wants the deal that underpins globalization to continue for the next 30 years. It wants to be a mercantilist power. It wants to be the producer. It's become the big lender, of course, to Asia as well. And it wants, at the same time, what it calls technological sovereignty. So it's not going to be pushed around by US tech firms, military defense tech firms. It's going to have tech sovereignty on everything. That's its plan. Now, my view on this is that, and it's shaped by an economic historian called Charles Kindleberger, who wrote the book on the 1930s. Kindleberger says the reason we had the 1930s depression wasn't because Wall Street crashed and because some banks went bust. It was because there was Great Britain, as the declining imperial power, could no longer play the role of global leader. And at the same time, the United States was not yet ready to step into the role of global leader itself. And I don't mean militarily here. I mean in terms of, and Kindleberger said, it's in terms of setting standards of behavior, taking distressed loans, basically becoming the lender of last resort for the world. Now, as we've seen, the Federal Reserve, much to the surprise of everybody, I think including the boss of the Fed himself, the Fed has turned out to once again be the world's banker. That the sudden injection of swap lines to the whole Western world was a stunning act, and I think a brave and laudable act that they did in mid-March, because money was draining out of Britain, of Europe, back to short-term US treasuries. So good for them. The problem we have today is similar to the 30s. However, America can't be the global economic power that's powerful enough to hold the thing together, and China doesn't want to be. That's the way I look at it as an economic historian and an economic journalist. So what I think is going to happen, I think there obviously is a case, whether governments make the case for reparations, individual citizens will, I think, especially in a litigious country like the United States, I think will eventually take a class action against China over the release of the mismanagement and the misinformation. Because it's not just mismanagement, there is a perpetual stream coming from Moscow and Beijing and their proxies on the internet of misinformation about where this came from. I don't even want to honor it with repeating it. The art of doing this, I think, is to try and maintain some semblance of a global economic multilateral order, because we all know what the reservoir dogs scenario is, when everybody, China points the gun at America's head, America at China, and both are pointing at Europe. That's the three big powers, and they all have huge dysfunctions. The dysfunction of the United States at the moment is geopolitically, it doesn't want to engage, I would argue, with a lot of the world. The dysfunction of China is it's a dictatorship, and it's heavily reliant on extending and pretending to its own private sector, which is really suffering. And Europe, how long have you got? Because Europe wants to do a fiscal stimulus, the same as everybody else has done, but the governance of the Eurozone doesn't allow it to do that. And so there's even a possibility that Europe will blow up. So I'm probably not answering it in the way that some people, to give you a kind of, we can discipline China. I don't think the Western world is in a position to discipline China economically anymore, because, look, you had the whole argument about Huawei technologies. We in Britain, we have a conservative government just as kind of Trumpian as your government. They let them in. And the Italian government the government that did this was just as conservative as Trump. The Italian government said, welcome China. So the Chinese soft power is heavily enmeshed now, especially in the weaker parts of the European economy. And I don't think you can take that apart. I think if we do, then what I would say is to policymakers, and I know there are some people maybe in the policy field listening to this. I think the important thing is to read about what happened in the 30s and understand that a moment came in the 30s when people very wedded to the old model and the old order said, look, it's there's not much as I lament its passing, it's gone. So we now have to adjust to a new model and a new geopolitical order. I think without wanting it, you don't have to revel in the breakup of the global order, but I think you have to. I mean, those of you involved in risk management, long-term risk planning, you have to think about things like what would happen if the factories of Guangdong province were no longer enthusiastically producing for the American tech market.
Well, that's a perfect segue into the next question, which is talking about the decoupling of the US and Chinese economies being accelerated. Who are the likely beneficiaries of that decoupling? Is it the less developed states in the United States? Is it India, or is it somewhere in Latin America?
Well, look, I think that the funny thing is everybody was talking about decoupling for 10, 20 years. The really interesting thing is that real decoupling in this crisis is between the financial markets and the real economy. Because as soon as the Fed and the other central banks put the money in mid-March, as you know, the stock markets came back. But going to the question, I think who benefits absolutely is the population, the working population of the developed world, of the G7. And you may know this famous elephant graph. If not, I can draw it on my screen. Basically, the lowest part of the world's population benefited from 20, 30 years of globalization. The richest 1% benefited, but this bit here, the trunk of the elephant, is the workers of Nashville, Tennessee, of Birmingham, England, of Lyon, France, and they didn't benefit so much. So it's a no-brainer that if we do see nearshoring, I think we'll see some onshoring of production lines. We're going to see nearshoring, and I think when we think about that, I think all governments now will have to develop a function that considers they've all got an energy security function. So they're always thinking, well, how much oil is in the Gulf of Mexico in the American thing, or in American context, or in Britain, how much gas comes through the pipeline that links us to Europe? Okay. Now we're going to have that kind of thinking about where are the production lines of strategic industries like medical goods industries. So it turns out that nearshoring in the UK's case for medical goods is Tunisia and Turkey. But then when they went to Turkey, they had to send a C-130 over to pick up the stuff. And when they came, it was so bad they had to scrap it. So you've got to start thinking geopolitically about supply chains. I mean, that's absolutely, I think, going to happen. And in the United States context, I think you would then be, Latin and Central America is not all one thing, as you know, and you're quite close to it there. That the key player, unless you want to put everything on a super tanker, the key player is going to be Mexico. And I think it's going to have to be a partner for the United States. Whatever the U.S. administration is, it's going to have to be a U.S. partner in stabilizing and guaranteeing and securing the supply chains of U.S. industries. And yeah, I mean, I say Nashville, Tennessee for a reason. When I've been in those states, those Midwestern and Southern Midwestern states where you've got quite a relatively low-paid workforce, quite a lot of recent migrants in the workforce, I think their wages are going to rise. I think that the prospects of those production lines are going to rise. The big problem is what happens to face-to-face service industries, because let's not forget we're talking about a virus here. In France, there was a study that came out this morning. The French study where they tested something like 20,000 people. Only 5% of the French population's tested has the virus. So even if we get a vaccine in 18 months' time, there's a lot of waves of this virus to go through. And so I think that the entertainment industry, the hospitality industry, the services industry is going to be really tough. And we're going to see these income support schemes are going to be here for longer than we think.
All right, I have more questions than we actually have time for, but running the risk of going a little bit past 10:45, there is a series of questions that talk about injection of capital and inflation, but also where you had mentioned the entrepreneurship of government.
Yeah.
Someone sent in a question talking about government investment in private companies that were maybe too big to fail. But there was a real poignant question. And the question is, are we sacrificing long-term growth for short-term pain relief by stimulating the economy in the way that we're doing? And what's your opinion on that? I mean, there's more to the question, but let's.
This is the dilemma that's facing all governments, and to my great surprise, every single one of them, including the federal government in the USA, has in the end prioritized the meeting the epidemiological needs. You can argue whether it's done it well or not, but it never said we're going to let this rip. As you may know, our own Prime Minister Boris Johnson was the closest of any politician to just basically saying we take it on the chin, is what he said. No, he was shocked into reality by being presented with research showing that instead of 20,000 people dying, there would be 500,000 people dying. Now, I think it's a false dichotomy. You know, the whole idea of, well, do we let it rip and people die, but the economy is saved? I just don't think that's the way it would pan out, because even with the relatively moderate relaxation of the lockdowns that are happening here in Europe, it's becoming very socially scratchy. So, for example, teachers' unions here are saying, we're not going back. No, you can order us going to go back. The fact is, we have a near monopoly on their workforce. We're not going. And these are not militant trade unions. They're just ordinary kind of trade union guys. You will know, those of you in business, that there is a war for talent right down to the shop floor. That once you've lost even a relatively unskilled employee, and once you've lost an outlet on the main street, even the one that wasn't making any money, it's hard to get it back. And it's probably the easiest in the United States. As you know, you have a job creation machine in your economy. Not so much in the rest of the developed world. You know, once it's gone, it's kind of gone. And I think that does warrant the level of, it's not just investment, it's literal pouring money down the drain of keeping people alive who are not working. But at some point, this has to switch. And if this becomes a 6 to 9 month thing, obviously, the smart thing to do is for the government to intervene into the employment market and to literally start to divert labor from sectors that are just not going to come back. I'm afraid we have this huge restaurant, coffee bar, hairdressers, nail salon, low wage employment, temporary employment here in Britain. A lot of that's not coming back. I'm afraid the Great British Pub may find it quite difficult to come back. So what do? Someone has to say, right, look, if we're going to spend money, taxpayers' money, there comes a point when it's better to spend that money actually creating new industries. And for those economies, in the UK is one that have signed up to the Paris climate targets, it's a no-brainer where that industry needs to be. So there is a market for wind turbines here. There's a market for solar power. There's a market for insulating people's homes. We have a problem with coal, not heat, unlike you. There's a market for rewilding forests. We could repurpose the workforce, but the state's the only body that can do that. And I think that to finish on the issue of is it worth it, we are going to end up with a huge debt. The United States, already have a huge and rising debt. And going back to my John Maynard Keynes quote, my pessimism about the world economy fundamentally flows from the fact that we have spent and borrowed and created a lot of money in the last 10 years, 12 years since Lehman Brothers, on the assumption that there is a future in which there is high growth, high productivity, and relatively high inflation which erodes those debts over a long period, as happened after World War II. I'm not so confident that's going to happen. And that's why I think that developed world governments are going to be living with 100% to GDP, debt to GDP ratio for a long time. I think the tragedy would be if we end up tearing each other apart in politics over you were the person in power at the time when the debt went from 80 to 100. You were the power. That's just not a valid thing to do. Likewise, central banks are going to be in it for the long term. They are monetizing, that is, they're buying and holding to maturity debt. They are engaged in a helicopter money operation. The way I explain this to Joe Public, the ordinary person, is it's like the central bank giving a bridging loan from the future to the present. And the future is my godchildren's generation are going to have to deal with this because we can't. We are at the hilt of what we can do. All debates in politics that begin from we need to balance the books, we need fiscal austerity. I think the heartening thing is the wing of politics that wanted that here in Britain 10 years ago really sees that you just can't have it. Above all, because I'll finish now. Above all, because we need to rebuild the capacity of the healthcare system. So thank you for listening.
Last question.
Oh, go.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask this question, please. What do you see the effect on Las Vegas as a tourist destination as compared to the rest of the U.S. cities?
Well, look, I have been in a casino in Las Vegas, and what's interesting is, without wanting to be unkind to the industry, you can be quite solitary in a casino. You can be quite solitary sitting in the bar of a casino, playing on one of those screens in front of you, being your beer is handed to you for free by the barman and all that. It's not the same as, for example, Disneyland. And it's not the worst thing is, the theater, the opera, NFL, baseball. That's where I think that those forms of entertainment are going to be pretty challenged. I also think, for what it's worth, if you're in the movie business, invest in animation, because that's the way that's going to be going forward. But I think for Las Vegas, I'm not aware of how successful or unsuccessful the business model itself was. I know that my reading of the experience of being in Vegas is that obviously once the person is there, the business model is to give them the highest value opportunity, i.e. the highest revenue generating opportunity. So it's constantly to move tourism and entertainment up market, up the scale of the market. And I think that, my goodness, after this is over, or once we are all allowed to travel, people will be looking for a good time. But they'll probably have a reservoir of spare cash in their pocket because they've been sitting at home. B, they will probably be prepared to pay a higher premium for an experience that is no longer possible. In London, I'm a member of a private drinking club, as many of us are. I expect it to reopen, because what I expect it to do is charge me a lot more for my membership fees and to put in place the kind of safety standards that an ordinary British pub can't do. And so I think that model, the model of membership, joining, of exclusivity, is probably the thing that's going to survive in the entertainment industry.
Excellent. All right, with that, I'm going to say thank you, Paul. This was a terrific presentation. There are even more questions, but we're already over.
Yeah.
So thank you, everybody. I want to thank everybody. The questions were terrific. Adam, Steve, Jenny, Lizzie, Jason, really great questions. But we're going to end here. We are going to have a copy of this presentation available on our website later afterwards. So please feel free to check back to econclublv.org. That's econclublv.org. And we'll have this under the events tab. Also, next week, that is May 19th, Tuesday, we'll be hosting retail economist Richard Kestenbaum. So he'll be talking about the future of retail sector in the United States economy. So thank you, everybody, and have a fantastic day. Thanks again, Paul.
Thank you.